Okay, so you are a contributor of an open source project and somebody has put in a feature request asking you to add OIDC, and you are genuinely looking into the topic to decide whether or not to add this feature to your application. This video will provide the answers to the questions you are looking for in order to make that decision. When we talk about adding OIDC, what we're actually talking about is adding an identity server such as Keycloak. So why would you want to add an identity server? The reason is to avoid work. So we want to avoid reinventing the wheel. But how am I reinventing the wheel right now? What is your use case? You might think, well, I have no need for log on at all. I'll just give everybody admin access immediately. Well, as your program evolves, there may be a reason to have like an admin access and a read only access. We're essentially planning for the future. And it may be that you didn't add the user attributes, right? The ability to log in and whatnot, just because you didn't want to have to add that as a feature, right? That's going to be a lot of work. Oh, I need to, build the form so that people can log in. And what about like password recovery? Is that something you even thought about? It's possible maybe in your open source project, you've already added the ability to create a user and let people log in. Maybe you're even granting access in some way. But when it comes to password recovery, are you allowing them to do like send a text message with a value that they can use, or use like email recovery? There's quite a bit of effort to set something like that up. And if you use an identity server, one of these identity and access management servers, you may already get that ability. You might also get like multi-factor authentication, a modern feature, and you don't want to have to put the effort in to recreate this. And I mean, it's security, right? What if you do something wrong? Now there's a vulnerability. But if you could just trust somebody else, and that's what we're doing with the identity server. That's what OIDC is, the Open ID Connect, right? Open Identity Connect. We're providing values that say, I trust this identity server over here to perform the identity check, right? So then you end up with these benefits here. So you don't care where the users are actually coming from. They could be coming from like LDAP or GitHub or Azure or Gmail, right? So what your application does is it just provides, here's who I trust. When the users access your website or your web API, there's a method there. Well, the web API should probably be using an API key, but it can also use the OIDC. Let's just focus on the website. The website is going to redirect them to Keycloak. They're going to log in there, and Keycloak's going to check behind the scenes using LDAP or wherever the account is that it has been configured to care about. And then it's going to come back to your application to say, here's the username. These are claims, right? Here's the username, here's their email, maybe some other values, and now you can just go with it without having to do any of those checks. And if the person fails to log in, your application doesn't really hear about it so much, right? It's like it gives them a chance to retry their password. This is all happening outside of your application. And if they need to do a password recovery or whatnot, that all gets taken care of. All you have to focus on as a developer is your application. And that's what we want, right? We don't want to have to deal with all this user stuff. The other thing is what comes is a configured groups claim. You have to configure this on your Keycloak server, but for example, if the user is a member of an LDAP group, you can say you'll get that group listing, right? So if you have a group for admins, now you get that group. If you have a group for read-only users or whatnot, you get that group. And that's how you control security in your application. So it provides the identity, and then through the groups, that's how you control access. And if nothing else, even if you don't care about user accounts, you don't care about security, you don't care about having an admin account and, regular user accounts or a read-only account, if you don't care about any of this, there's a consistency, right? So if you have 20 applications in your home lab and 19 of them are set up with OIDC, and yours is set up with a sort of reinvented, customized, here's how I create users and deal with that. You can log into one of those 19 sites and then you can access all 19 sites. But when they go to your site, it's going to prompt them to log in. So no matter what happens, even though they're logged into all these others, yours is the outlier that you can't you have to log in special. And if the password changes with all other 19, right? Because you just change your password in LDAP or whatever, all 19, they still work, or if you're, or at least you just have to log in once and now we have access again. But when we come to your app, you try to use that new password, right? They will, it won't work because you have your own unique system and you have to go into that and change the password there. Okay, let's say you're thinking about it. Maybe this would be a good thing, and how difficult would it be to implement? Let's first go over a high-level overview of what applications typically do. And usually there is a way to log in as an admin. The more advanced applications have the ability to configure OIDC through the GUI, right? So you would have to first be able to get in there before you could do that. So this would be like the default admin access when you first stand up an application. However, almost always, you can also configure OIDC through a configuration file. And that's the way you want to do it. I don't have a note here, but you want to have the configuration option. That way you can stand up the application and immediately begin using OIDC without ever having to take a step where you log in as the admin. But it's usually there. So if you've already got it, you don't have to remove it. Just leave it in there. And then add the ability to OIDC. So here I'm talking about your application. So you'll have to do some adjustment, and we'll talk more about that process here in the next slide. But just initially get OIDC working so that you have that redirect, right? They go to your application and it immediately redirects them over to something like Keycloak, and then it comes back and it's like the user logged in successfully. So that is an excellent starting point. You can just grant access, like you are an admin if you're able to log in successfully, right? So like it's not an anonymous access. You do have to have a valid user account, but if you do, then you get admin access. It's a great start because from there, now OIDC is working. So all you have to do is take a look at the group's claim. So now, based on the groups that the person is a member of, you can create admin access or user access, right? Which is the beginning, right? You've got to have something that you don't want users messing with. Make a couple settings, right? Start setting things as admin only. And then the opposite, of course, would just be if you're not an admin, then you get the user access. And then over time, right? It's open source. Everybody's going to be submitting issues of use cases that they have special. It's going to take time to figure out like, well, what user should have what access. You might want to have like an admin and a read only that's common, and then an actual user. You might want to have like developers and versus somebody who can make a little bit of change but not as much as a developer. You know, that's something you can figure out over time. But you don't have to figure it out right away, right? No need to hesitate implementing the OIDC, even though you haven't worked out all these details. You can just right at the beginning, it can just be a valid login, and you're there, right? You've got the single sign-on, so if somebody changes the password, they can still get in. This is cool. This is a great start. And then, right, admin user, it's inevitable. And then figure out those other details over time. You can always work that out later. You just want to start your momentum, right? You want to get it going and no time like the present. Okay, so what we've got here is a screenshot from an application called Harbor. It's an on-site container repo. And in my opinion, it's just perfect, right? This is an ideal implementation of OIDC. So I can't click on it, right? Because it's a screenshot, but here they have off mode. They offer a few other options like LDAP and whatnot. So if in your application you've already set up LDAP, you could keep it around for people who care. But otherwise, you can let them select OIDC. So let me just talk about some of these values. It can seem overwhelming at first, but there's really only a few. So the name, it's just the name that shows up when the person goes to log in, right? It's just to keep track of things. It's not super important here. The endpoint, this is where it starts to get interesting. You're saying my application trusts this endpoint to handle the authentication, right? So that's going to be your Keycloak server or Azure Identity Server or whatnot. As you experiment with this, as you set up Keycloak and start configuring applications just to see it work before you implement your own application, and to make sure it's working before you start implementing your own application. You'll find that it's also necessary to provide a client ID. So you have an endpoint and then you have a client ID. And this is because on your identity server, you can have multiple clients set up. So different clients for different applications. Or in a home lab environment, you might just have one client ID that you use with all your applications. So just keep it simple. I would say you're just learning this. So maybe just have one client ID that you set up in your Keycloak server, just called default. And then you can have a client secret. So some applications, you can just configure a client. You don't even need a secret. And some applications require both. You have to have both a client ID and a client secret. So I'll let you play around with that, but those are the three most important values here. So as you implement your application, if you're setting up OIDC, you're going to have to get these somehow from the user, either through a configuration file or by allowing them to configure it through the GUI and then save it out to a configuration file. You do want to have it in a configuration file so that the user doesn't have to go into the GUI. Now here's the groups claim. So by default, everybody uses the word groups. But if you wanted, for some reason, to allow them to specify a different groups claim, maybe somebody uses the word group instead of the word groups, right? So this is allowing you to change that default. And I would recommend the same. Use a default of groups. OIDC admin group. So this is specific to this application. You don't have to have this. I'm not even going to talk about it. Now, OIDC scope, this is something related to the claims, right? So I said before, if you log in successfully, your application will then receive the claims from the identity server. So this will be like a username, an email, etc. So these are typically the claims that you would implement. And I don't think we should go into detail here, but you'll have to learn about this just a little bit. OpenID just means it works with OpenID Connect. Email is that you want to get the user's email, right? These are the claims that you're requesting from the identity server. Profile is going to give you their username, right? So typically, and more, not just the username, but by requesting the user's profile, you're going to get what the identity server considers claims related to a profile. Offline access is related to the access token, right? So as you begin to work with OIDC, what you actually get from the identity server is a token that you can then check back with the identity server and say, like, is this token valid? Because the token will expire after a while and then the user will have to log in again. We don't have to talk about that though. By implementing OIDC, you're just going to get that benefit. You can configure the expiration of things on the Keycloak server when you configure your client ID, right? So by default, it might expire, pretty quick. If in a home lab environment, you might want to change that to, 8 hours. And if you work 8 hours, then you only have to log in once, right? That sort of thing. Verify certificate. I'd say this is important because this is a little hit and miss on different projects. When people are first setting up your application and using OIDC, it's useful to allow this checkbox to exist because on your on-prem setup with Keycloak, if you haven't set up valid certificates in your environment, then a verification check of the certificates will fail, right? So for development purposes, set it up so that they can work with the Keycloak server that doesn't have the certificates set up yet, right? Because that's something that might take people a little bit of time to get working, and they're in their lab environment, right? They're learning. But then after a while, once you get your certificate set up correctly, you want to verify the certificates. So then you go ahead and check that box. Automatic onboarding. This is because it has its own database of users, and this may be applicable to your application. Maybe you don't need to keep track of users in your application. It might be enough that you have the groups claim to grant the access, but if you do need that, you should have a value like this, automatic onboarding. So by checking this box in Harbor, when you log in for the first time, it creates a local user account and it stores data related to that user. And it automatically creates the account, right? If this is not checked, it will not create accounts. So you only have the accounts that you have existing. And it's nice to have this as a value just to make it really clear whether or not you're going to create the accounts. And generally, applications do either create the account or if there's no account needed, right? The idea being that you log in with having never logged in before, you're going to be able to access the application, and you want that, whether you actually create an account behind the scenes or not. And then lastly, we have this username claim. So this can vary a little bit depending on who's actually providing the user account behind the scenes. So I'm using Active Directory. So through Keycloak, I'm getting this value of Sam account name. And this can vary a little bit, so you want to have the ability to specify this. Um, in other situations, it might be preferred username. In other situations, it might just be username. But because we have the freedom of the OIDC and the identity server, this is one thing you might want to change, just like groups might have a slightly different spelling. The people who use OIDC, they don't need a GUI. They'd be okay just doing it through a configuration file. Okay, so I figured you might want to see a quick demo. So here we are, Harbor, and this is just what you typically see when someone has implemented OIDC on an app. Usually you have both options, right? So if you need to log in as admin for some reason, there's usually an option to do that. And then you can go in and configure the GUI to configure OIDC. But I've already done that. In this case, I did it through a configuration file. So the first time I log in, I can just click on my OIDC provider. I get redirected over, perhaps successfully. Okay, and I'll try logging out, but and then here's another example, Argo CD. So single sign-on's already in effect, right? So it went ahead and logged me in immediately, but I'm gonna log out. And here we go. This is a similar main page, right? So by default, you log in as Keycloak, but it still has this old technique in case you needed to log in as admin. And in this case, I also configured it through the configuration file. So the very first time I logged in, I just logged in through Keycloak, and right, it's not prompting me for the name and password because I've already logged in and the token's in effect. So just to give another example, here's Taiga. It's a Kanban board I've used for a while. So this is a little bit older application, so it still works with OIDC. I had to configure it, but you see how it just looks a little bit different? Instead of having the OIDC first, they've still got their original login, right? But the idea is the same. So you could still log in as an admin here, or you can just log in with Keycloak and everything's good to go. Okay, so whether or not you have decided at this point to add OIDC to your application, I hope I have inspired you to begin setting up single sign-on with an identity server with all the other applications that you have in your environment. So just start Googling, check to find out if they support OIDC, stand up a Keycloak server or Azure Identity Server, some sort of identity server, and then configure something that already supports it. Maybe go ahead and download Harbor, and maybe that can just be a good first experience of setting up and working with OIDC. I think you will be inspired. And once all of the other things in your environment are all using OIDC and you've gotten up to speed on the technology, when you consider whether or not you should add OIDC to your application, I think you're going to make the right decision, or at least the decision we all hope you're going to make, because everybody using OIDC makes for a consistency that is just wonderful. And it saves you time. You're not having to reinvent the wheel all over the place. You get all those security benefits. I hope this video has been beneficial. I hope I have inspired you. Thank you for your time.